Most fortunes vanish within 3 generations. Self-made or inherited, it rarely matters. The money arrives, and then, quietly, it leaves. But a handful of families have broken that rule for 100 years, sometimes 200. They didn't get luckier than everyone else. They didn't earn more than everyone else. They built something almost invisible that the fortunes around them never had, something most people never think to look for because it doesn't show up in a photograph. Tonight, we're going to put 3 of the wealthiest names in modern history side by side with 3 names just as wealthy who lost almost everything. Same starting point, same opportunities, completely different endings, decades apart. One family still quietly owns a piece of nearly every major company in an entire country, and you have almost certainly never heard their name. Another built the most famous hotel in New York, out of pure spite, and is barely remembered today outside of history books. A third is fighting, right now, in a courtroom, over the very fortune that made its name legendary in the first place. By the end of this video, you'll see the one thing that actually decides whether a fortune becomes a legacy, passed down with the family name intact, or a rumor, a footnote, a story someone's grandmother half remembers. Here's the myth. Old money survives simply because it's old. Because the family started with more, so of course they still have more today. It sounds reasonable enough that almost nobody questions it. It's also almost the opposite of true. An old phrase, shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations. One generation builds the fortune, usually through some combination of risk, timing, and relentless work. The next generation manages what it inherited, often competently, sometimes brilliantly. The third generation, raised entirely inside the money, having never once known what scarcity actually feels like, spends it, not out of malice, not even out of stupidity usually, simply because nobody ever taught them what the money was for, or what it cost to build in the first place. It isn't a curse, whatever the old families themselves might have told each other at the time. It's a pattern, and it repeats itself with almost mechanical consistency, across centuries, across continents, across industries as different as shipping, retail, and banking. Sudden wealth, it turns out, behaves the same way almost everywhere it appears. Makes the handful of families who avoided that pattern worth studying properly. Not with a breezy list of 7 habits of old money families, the kind of thing you'll find cluttering the internet. With something closer to a courtroom, where evidence gets weighed pair by pair. Tonight, 3 pairs. In each pair, one family started from a nearly identical position of extreme wealth, extreme influence, and extreme public visibility. One family from each pair is still there today. One family from each pair isn't, in any way that matters. A banking dynasty whose very surname became a byword for wealth itself, set directly against a shipping and railroad fortune that was, for one dazzling moment in the 19th century, the largest private fortune anywhere on Earth. The second pair, a family so wealthy and so deliberately quiet about it that they hold a meaningful slice of an entire nation's stock market without ever appearing on a single public wealth ranking, set against one of the most glamorous, most photographed names in American high society, a name attached to grand hotels, sprawling mansions, and eventually, uncomfortably, a criminal courtroom. The third pair, a family whose holding company still controls a Formula One team, a legendary football club, and one of the world's most storied car manufacturers, set against an heiress who inherited what would be nearly $1 billion in today's money, and died with almost nothing left to her name at all. Watch closely as we move through each of them, because the difference between these 6 families was never simply how much money they had at their peak. Every single one of them, without exception, controlled more wealth than nearly anyone alive during their era. The difference was what they built around the money once they had it, or, in 3 of these 6 cases, what they never got around to building at all. None of these 6 stories are secument or an anonymous source. Every fact in tonight's video comes from public reporting, public court records, and public financial disclosures. What's missing isn't the information. What's missing is anyone laying all 6 families side by side at the same time and asking the one question that actually matters. Not, how did they get rich, which is a question about the past, but what did they build once they were rich, which is a question about the future they were trying, consciously or not, to protect. That second question is the one almost nobody in your own life ever asks out loud either. We talk endlessly about how to make money. We talk far less about what happens to it once you're no longer the one making the decisions, whether that's because of a bad diagnosis, a sudden death, a messy divorce, or simply old age catching up the way it eventually catches up with everyone. The 6 families tonight all faced some version of that exact question at some point, whether they realized it or not. 3 of them had already built an answer before the question arrived. 3 of them hadn't, and paid for it in full. Let's start with the oldest name in banking. The Rothschild name has been synonymous with wealth for so long that most people assume it's a historical relic, a story from old textbooks, not a living, breathing family with real assets today. That assumption is wrong, and understanding exactly why is the first clue in tonight's investigation. Today, the family remains actively involved in banking, asset management, winemaking, real estate, and philanthropy, spread across several countries and several independent branches of the same bloodline. Rothschild & Co., the family's flagship banking institution, currently manages more than 87 billion euros, close to $100 billion in client and family assets. The family also still holds some of the most prestigious vineyards in all of France, including Chateau Lafite Rothschild and Chateau Mouton Rothschild, wines that continue to define what serious generational luxury wine collecting actually looks like, more than a century after they first entered the family's hands. Here's where it gets genuinely interesting, and where you have to be careful with what you read online. Search for Rothschild net worth, and you'll find numbers ranging from a modest few billion dollars all the way up to breathless claims of multiple trillions, entire corners of the internet insisting the family secretly controls the global economy from behind the curtain. The more sober, more carefully reported version of the story tells you something very different. One widely cited estimate from the Sunday Times put the visible combined wealth of the actively engaged family closer to $1 billion. The eye-popping trillions figure simply has no serious financial backing behind it at all. It's internet mythology dressed up as fact, and it's worth remembering that distinction the next time you see the number repeated online as though it were settled, established truth. What actually explains the family's staying power isn't a secret vault stuffed with hidden trillions. It's structure, plain and unglamorous as that word sounds. Each branch of the family today operates independently through professional firms and family offices, rather than functioning as one centrally controlled empire the way it may have once operated generations ago, back when the name alone could move markets. No single living Rothschild sits at the very top of one pyramid, personally controlling everyone else's money and everyone else's decisions. The wealth, instead, is diversified across countries, across industries, and across generations of family members who each run their own piece of it professionally, rather than depending on one dynastic decision-maker somewhere at the top to get everything right, forever, on behalf of everyone beneath them. That's a strange thing to learn about a family whose surname is practically a synonym for old money itself. Their real secret isn't concentration of power in fewer hands. It's the opposite. Deliberate separation. Every branch insulated from every other branch's mistakes so that no single failure, no single reckless error could ever threaten the whole structure at once. Notice, too, what this structure quietly costs the family in return for that protection. No single Rothschild alive today can simply pick up the phone and move the entire family fortune in one direction, on a personal whim, the way the head of a less structured dynasty might. That kind of unilateral power is gone, deliberately traded away generations ago for something the family apparently valued more: the near certainty that no single mistake, no single scandal, no single reckless grandson could ever bring the whole house down at once. It's a trade most people never consciously make, because most people never build enough to need to make it. The Rothschilds made it, and it's arguably the single decision that mattered more than any individual investment the family ever placed. Now compare that quiet, compartmentalized survival to a family who, for one dazzling moment in American history, was wealthier than any Rothschild who has ever lived. In 1877, Cornelius Vanderbilt, the man everyone simply called the Commodore, was, by most serious accounts, the richest man on the entire planet. He'd built an empire, first out of shipping and later out of railroads, at a scale nobody in America had ever attempted before him, let alone achieved. If you'd told anyone alive that year that the Vanderbilt name would mean essentially nothing within a single century, they would have laughed you out of the room without a second thought. Wrong to laugh, but only because they couldn't have imagined how completely the fall would happen. Less than 50 years after the Commodore's death, no Vanderbilt appeared anywhere among the world's wealthiest people, not one single descendant. And by the time a full century had passed, what remained of what was once the largest private fortune in the world had been split among 787 descendants, a number so large it renders any individual share almost meaningless, a rounding error where a dynasty used to stand. What happened in between is a case study in exactly the kind of collapse that structure is designed to prevent. The Commodore's own children and grandchildren spent lavishly, competing openly with one another to build bigger, more ornate, more extravagant homes. Mansions like the Breakers in Newport, Rhode Island, each one grander than the last, each one functioning less like a home and more like a public scoreboard for a family that had started measuring its worth in marble walls and ballroom chandeliers instead of balance sheets. They became fixtures of New York high society, setting its trends rather than quietly ignoring them the way genuinely secure money often can afford to. They gave generously to fashionable charitable causes, through elaborate fairy tale themed parties that made headlines, and raced yachts, automobiles, and horses largely for the sake of simply being seen doing it in front of the right people. None of that, entirely on its own, would necessarily have been fatal. What made it fatal was the complete absence of anything holding the fortune together as a single, protected unit. There was no central structure forcing any restraint on any individual family member, no mechanism separating the family's collective wealth from each person's private impulses and appetites. As more descendants arrived with each passing generation, the fortune wasn't managed as one coherent asset, the way the Rothschild branches managed theirs. It was simply divided, again and again and again, while the family's core business, the New York Central Railroad, was already quietly losing ground to trucks, barges, and eventually airplanes. By the time you reach the present day, the connection between the Vanderbilt name and any actual Vanderbilt money has become so thin that Anderson Cooper, the television anchor, and a great-great-great-grandson of the Commodore through his mother, the designer Gloria Vanderbilt, said plainly in a radio interview that there was no trust fund waiting for him. Not a modest one, not a symbolic one, none at all, by his own account. That's the wealthiest family in the entire world in the year 1877, reduced within 3 generations to a name a television anchor has to publicly explain isn't attached to any money whatsoever. The fortune didn't survive a single structural gap for even one complete century. What makes the Vanderbilt story so useful, rather than simply sad, is how ordinary the actual mechanism of the collapse was. Nobody stole the fortune in one dramatic heist. No single crash wiped it out overnight. It simply leaked, steadily, generation after generation, through mansions nobody needed, parties nobody remembered by the following week, and a family structure that treated the money as belonging to each individual heir personally, rather than to the family as a continuing institution. Multiply modest, forgivable individual choices by enough descendants, across enough decades, and even the largest fortune on the planet eventually reaches zero. That's not a morality tale about greed. It's closer to simple arithmetic, playing out over 100 years. If the Rothschild name is famous, and the Vanderbilt name has become a cautionary tale told at dinner parties, the next family on tonight's list is almost the opposite of both, because you have probably never heard of them at all. That absence isn't an accident. It's the entire point of how they've operated for over a century. Butterflies. The Wallenberg family from Sweden controls a business empire that the Financial Times has valued by one estimate at roughly 250 billion euros, putting it in the same financial league as Elon Musk. And yet the Wallenbergs themselves, individually, don't appear on Forbes' billionaire rankings, or Bloomberg's, or anyone else's public list of the world's wealthiest people. That isn't a contradiction, it's the entire point. Not because they're hiding anything illegally, and not out of simple Scandinavian modesty, because the wealth, structurally, simply isn't held as personal wealth at all. Through a set of fall foundations, the Wallenbergs in Investor AB, one of Sweden's largest investment companies, while formally owning only around 23% of its actual shares. Through a separate vehicle, FAM AB, they hold 100% outright, no dilution at all. Between these two structures, the family controls or holds major influential positions in companies most of the world uses every single day, completely unaware any of it traces back to Sweden. ABB, Ericsson, AstraZeneca, Atlas Copco, the bank SEB, Electrolux, and the defense manufacturer Saab. By late 2025, the families of the entire Swedish stock market, down slightly from around 40% back in the 1970s, but still an almost unimaginable concentration of economic power inside a single developed economy, all of it resting with a family whose surname draws blank stares from almost anyone outside their own country's borders. Here's the input for a moment, because it explains almost everything else. Because the money sits inside foundations rather than in any single individual's name, no Wallenberg can simply withdraw it, spend it on a fleet of private yachts, or leave it directly to a favorite grandchild in a will, the way any ordinary wealthy person could. The structure was deliberately, patiently built to survive the mistakes, the ambitions, and even the ordinary human greed of any one person born into the family. Leadership has historically passed to just one or two capable family members per generation, not divided evenly among every single heir the way an estate normally would be, which prevents exactly the kind of fragmentation that dissolved the Vanderbilt fortune into 787 separate, meaningless pieces. Visibility in this light isn't modesty for its own sake either. It's active protection. A family that never appears on any rich list never becomes a target for the kind of social pressure, public scrutiny, or performative spending that turned other, louder fortunes into public spectacles and eventually into public failures. The Wallenbergs didn't outlast a century and a half of history by being flashier or smarter investors than everyone around them. They outlasted it by making absolutely sure the fortune never depended on any single person behaving well, indefinitely, forever, without exception. Think about how counterintuitive that actually is for a moment. Somewhere in the 20th century, a family that could have plastered its name across buildings, yachts, and headlines the way so many wealthy families did, apparently decided the opposite was safer. Fame is expensive to maintain, and it invites exactly the kind of attention that eventually corrodes a fortune from the outside, through lawsuits, through kidnapping risk, through public pressure to spend visibly and prove the wealth is real. Anonymity, by contrast, is nearly free to maintain, and it starves all of that pressure before it ever has a chance to start. The Wallenbergs didn't just build a legal structure. They built a culture of deliberate invisibility around that structure, and the two reinforce each other. Now, for the second pair, and this time we start with the family that fell, because their rise is the story that makes the eventual fall so painful to watch unfold. The Astor name once belonged to the single wealthiest family in the United States, and one of the most theatrical, most petty rivalries of Gilded Age New York produced, almost entirely by accident, one of the most famous hotels anywhere on Earth. Caroline Schermerhorn Astor held the unofficial but fiercely, jealously guarded title of the Mrs. Astor, the reigning queen of New York high society, the woman whose approval decided who belonged and who didn't. Her nephew, William Waldorf Astor, wanted that exact social status for his own wife, and when he couldn't get it through the normal channels of society, he didn't write a strongly worded letter about it. He tore down his side of the connected Astor family brownstones entirely and built a hotel, the Waldorf, directly next door to his aunt's own house, close enough that the hotel's constant traffic and noise became genuinely impossible for her to ignore. She moved out of the neighborhood entirely, in a documented fury. Her son, John Jacob Astor IV, wasn't about to let that insult stand unanswered. He built his own hotel, the Astoria, directly beside the Waldorf, and made absolutely sure it was built taller. Eventually, exhausted by the standoff, the two cousins connected their competing hotels with a single narrow passage, one they could supposedly wall off with brick at a moment's notice if the fragile family truce ever collapsed again. It never did collapse. The combined Waldorf Astoria became, for a time, the largest hotel anywhere in the world, born entirely out of a family feud over a social title, not out of any careful business plan whatsoever. That story shows a family at the absolute height of its confidence, wealth, and social reach. What happened afterward shows exactly how quickly all of that can quietly unravel. Across the 20th century, the family's real estate and hotel empire, including the Waldorf Astoria itself, slipped away piece by piece, as Vincent Astor eventually sold off nearly half of the family's remaining property holdings to cover changing economic realities. But the story that should concern you most tonight isn't really that business decline. It's what happened to Vincent Astor's widow, Brooke Astor, one of America's most publicly celebrated philanthropists, in the final, vulnerable years of her long life. As she developed Alzheimer's disease and became increasingly incapacitated, unable to fully understand her own finances anymore, her own son, Anthony Marshall, quietly took control of her money and began paying himself an annual salary of $1 million while extracting more and more of her remaining assets for his own benefit. He was eventually convicted on 14 of 16 separate criminal charges, including first-degree grand larceny, and sentenced to prison for it. When Brooke Astor died in 2007, her estate was valued at around $192 million, a fraction of what the Astor name once represented at its peak, and even that remaining fortune had to be fought for in an open, public courtroom against her own child. The Astors, or to some sweeping economic collapse outside their control, they lost the family's protection against itself from the inside. When the wealth had no structure insulating it from a single person's ordinary human greed, even a son's greed toward his own incapacitated mother, there was nothing left standing between the money and the person willing to simply take it. There's something almost more unsettling about the Astor collapse than about the Vanderbilts, if you sit with it for a moment. The Vanderbilts lost their fortune to decades of ordinary extravagance, spread across hundreds of people, no single villain in the story. The Astors lost a meaningful piece of theirs to one specific person, inside the family, entrusted with exactly the kind of authority a trusting parent hands to a child without a second thought. No foundation would have prevented Brooke Astor's dementia, but a structure that didn't place her entire financial life in the unsupervised hands of one relative might have caught what happened years earlier than it actually was caught. Not every family that still rules the world has managed to avoid conflict entirely, and that's actually the more useful lesson here. The Agnelli family of Italy proves something more sophisticated than simple family harmony. You don't need a conflict-free family to protect a fortune. You need a structure strong enough to survive the conflict, whenever it eventually arrives. The Agnellis, through their holding company Exor, control an almost absurd range of household names across several industries at once. John Elkann, the family's current leader, serves as chairman of both Ferrari and the automaker Stellantis, and as CEO of Exor itself, the holding company that controls Ferrari, the agricultural and construction equipment manufacturer CNH Industrial, the storied football club Juventus, and even the publisher behind The Economist magazine. One family, operating through one single holding company, sits at the center of Formula One racing, European football, and one of the most respected news publications anywhere in the world. The mechanism behind that continued control is almost mathematically elegant once you see it laid out. A vehicle called Giovanni Agnelli BV, controlled entirely by the family, holds 56.9% of Exor's actual capital, but 86% of its voting rights. That gap between simple ownership and actual voting control is entirely deliberate, engineered on purpose. It means the family can never lose command of the empire simply by having its shares diluted, sold off, or split among more and more people the way the Vanderbilt fortune eventually was. Vote concentration, not just raw wealth concentration, is the mechanism doing the real structural work here. Here's the part that should make you lean in and pay closer attention, rather than relax and assume the lesson is finished. This exact structure is being tested right now in real time. In 2026, John Elkann and two of his siblings filed a lawsuit against their own mother, Margherita Agnelli, over the family's inheritance, arguing that they, and not she, should be the rightful sole heirs to the entire dynasty. That isn't some distant historical footnote. That is an active legal fight unfolding right now inside the very family we are holding up tonight as an example of staying power across generations. And that's exactly the point worth sitting with for a moment. The Agnellis are not, and have never been, a family without conflict, ambition, or dysfunction running underneath the surface. They are a family whose control of the empire simply doesn't depend on that conflict ever being resolved peacefully, or even resolved at all, ever. The voting structure sits above the family drama, entirely separate from it, rather than being vulnerable inside it. Whatever the eventual outcome of that courtroom fight, Exor's practical control of Ferrari, Stellantis, and Juventus isn't going to evaporate simply because a mother and her own children are fighting bitterly over money, because the structure itself was never built to require family harmony in the first place. To a family who had no such structure at all, whose entire fortune depended completely on the private judgment of one young woman, handed nearly $1 billion in today's terms before she'd even finished growing up. On the timing of the Agnelli lawsuit too, because it undercuts a comforting assumption a lot of viewers probably had walking into this video, that the families who still rule the world have somehow risen above the pettiness and self-interest that sank everyone else. They haven't. They simply built something that doesn't require them to rise above it. The structure does the work that character, discipline, and family harmony would otherwise have to do, perfectly, without fail, for generations. That's a far more realistic and far more replicable kind of success than just don't be greedy, which is advice that has never once worked reliably across an entire extended family in any country in any era of recorded history. Barbara Hutton was the granddaughter of Frank Winfield Woolworth, the retail tycoon who built one of the very first great American discount store empires from almost nothing. By her 21st birthday in 1933, her inheritance had grown to $42 million, worth roughly $967 million in today's money, on top of another $8 million inherited separately from her mother's estate. She wasn't simply wealthy. She was, for a brief moment, one of the single wealthiest women alive anywhere on the planet. The press nicknamed her the poor little rich girl, a label that started at her extravagant debutante ball in 1930, staged in the middle of the Great Depression, while much of the country stood in actual bread lines just outside. It stuck with her for the rest of her life, and for reasons that, as it turned out, had almost nothing to do with the size of her bank account. Hutton married and divorced 7 separate times over the course of her life. Each marriage arrived with its own settlement, its own set of extravagant gifts, its own quiet, steady drain on what remained of the fortune. In her divorce from one husband, the playboy Porfirio Rubirosa, she reportedly gave him a coffee plantation, jewelry, a stable of polo ponies, a military aircraft, and $2.5 million in cash outright. Of all 7 husbands, only one, the actor Cary Grant, ever walked away from the marriage without taking any settlement at all. There was no foundation standing quietly between Barbara Hutton and her own inheritance, no independent branch structure, the way the Rothschilds had built, no voting mechanism protecting the whole from any one person, the way the Agnellis had engineered. The money was simply hers, entirely, in full, to spend exactly as she personally wished, and what she wished, again and again, was to spend it on an increasingly opulent, increasingly isolated life. The finest homes money could buy, the finest clothes. Marriage after marriage after marriage, none of it ever quite managing to fill whatever the money was originally supposed to fill inside her. When Barbara Hutton finally died in 1979, at 66 years old, what remained of her share of the once enormous Woolworth fortune amounted to $3,000. Not $3 million, $3,000. A fortune that started at roughly $1 billion in today's terms ended in less money than most ordinary working people keep sitting in a checking account. It would be easy, and a little unfair, to reduce Barbara Hutton's story to a simple lesson about personal discipline, as if the only thing standing between her and a preserved fortune was better willpower. But willpower was never really the variable being tested here. She was handed an enormous, entirely liquid fortune, in her own name, at an age when very few people, wealthy or otherwise, have developed the judgment to manage that kind of responsibility alone. No foundation stepped in to slow the process down. No independent trustee had the standing to say no to a marriage, a gift, or a purchase. The money simply moved at the speed of her own decisions, for 46 years straight, with absolutely nothing built to create friction along the way. Dispersed of friction is the entire story. The Rothschilds have friction, built deliberately into separate branches. The Wallenbergs have friction, built into foundations no individual can raid. The Agnellis have friction, built into a voting structure no lawsuit can easily unwind. Barbara Hutton had none of that friction at all, at any point in her adult life, and the fortune behaved exactly the way water behaves when there's nothing built to contain it. It found the fastest way downhill. 6 families, now laid out side by side. 3 of them still hold real, functioning power today, quietly, inside banking vaults, foundation ledgers, and carefully engineered voting agreements most of the public will never read. 3 of them are now mostly stories people tell at dinner parties, if they're remembered by name at all anymore. And if you've genuinely been paying attention up to this point, you've probably already guessed what actually separated one group from the other. It wasn't the size of the original fortune. Every single family in tonight's video, at their absolute peak, controlled more money than almost anyone else alive during their era. The Commodore was, by most accounts, the richest man on the entire planet. Barbara Hutton was, briefly, one of the richest women alive anywhere. Size, on its own, was never the differentiator between these 6 families, because size, by itself, guarantees absolutely nothing about what happens next. Wasn't even the simple absence of family conflict either, however comforting that explanation might sound. We just watched the Agnellis fight openly over their own inheritance in an active 2026 lawsuit. Mother against her own children, inside a family we are holding up tonight as a genuine survivor. Conflict, greed, and dysfunction happened to the winners too, in plenty of ugly detail. What actually separated the families still standing today from the families now largely forgotten was whether the fortune was ever deliberately placed inside something bigger and more durable than any single person's judgment in any single moment. The Rothschilds split their empire into independent branches so that no one person's failure could ever sink the entire family at once. The Wallenbergs moved their wealth into foundations that no individual family member could withdraw from, spend on a private whim, or simply leave to a favorite child in a will. The Agnellis built a voting structure that keeps practical control of the empire fully intact, no matter how ugly or public the family fight over money eventually becomes. Never built that same wall around themselves. The Vanderbilt fortune had no structure protecting it from 787 separate descendants, each pulling in their own personal direction at once. The Astor fortune had no structure protecting Brooke Astor from her own son in the final vulnerable years of her life. The Woolworth fortune had no structure at all standing between Barbara Hutton and whatever she happened to feel like buying or marrying that particular year. You actually look closely at it, isn't really about being old at all. It's about whether the family, at some point, built something sturdier than any single person living inside it. Something that could survive a bad marriage, a greedy son, a bitter family lawsuit, or simply one heir who was never quite taught the meaning of restraint. The families who built that thing are still here today, still standing, still quietly influential. The families who never got around to building it have become the very stories we now tell each other as warnings. Unless, too, that none of the surviving 3 families got the structure perfectly right on the first attempt. The Rothschild empire of today looks nothing like the tightly centralized banking network of the 19th century. It evolved, branch by branch, adapting as circumstances changed across 200 years. The Wallenberg Foundation structure has been quietly adjusted across generations, most recently expanding succession beyond the old 1 or 2 heirs pattern as the family itself grew larger. Even the Agnelli voting structure, engineered decades ago, is only being tested for real, under real pressure, right now, in 2026, with no guarantee of how it ultimately resolves. Durability was never about designing something flawless once and walking away. It was about designing something that could keep being adjusted, generation after generation, without ever depending entirely on any single adjustment being made by any single perfect person. That's the real difference between a fortune and a legacy, if tonight's 6 stories have shown you anything at all. A fortune is a number, sitting in an account, vulnerable to exactly one bad decision at exactly the wrong moment. A legacy is a structure, built to absorb that bad decision when it eventually comes, because it always eventually comes, in every family, in every generation, without a single documented exception in tonight's video or anywhere else in recorded financial history. You don't need a family office, a foundation registered in Stockholm, or a controlling stake in a Formula One team for any of tonight's lesson to actually apply to you. The underlying mechanism works exactly the same way at any size of fortune, however modest. Ask yourself honestly, right now, sitting where you are, if something happened to you tomorrow, Does everything you've built depend entirely on you personally making every single decision correctly, forever, without fail? Or have you actually put anything in place? A trust, a clear written agreement with your family, even just a simple documented plan that would genuinely hold up even if you personally weren't the one holding it together anymore. Natural instinct, once you finally accumulate some real money, is to keep total, complete personal control over every single dollar of it. It feels responsible. It feels, understandably, like real ownership. But total, entirely unstructured personal control is exactly what the Vanderbilts had, exactly what the Astors had, exactly what Barbara Hutton had, right up until the moment it all quietly disappeared. Complete control, with absolutely nothing standing between the money and one single bad decision, made once, at the wrong moment. Real staying power, the kind that actually lasts across generations, often looks like the opposite of that instinct entirely. Deliberately giving up a small amount of personal control now, in exchange for a structure that doesn't depend on you, or your children, or your children's children, always getting every single decision right, forever, without a single exception. That isn't really a sacrifice, whatever it might feel like in the moment you sign the paperwork. That's the actual working definition of a legacy, something that survives you on purpose, by careful design, rather than surviving by pure luck, or worse, not surviving at all. The families in tonight's video who are still standing didn't get there because they were inherently smarter, luckier, or more personally disciplined than the families who eventually fell apart. They got there because, at some specific point, someone inside the family quietly decided the fortune itself mattered more than any single person's total control over it, including their own control, including their own pride. That decision, made once, carefully, generations ago by someone whose name most of us will never learn, is still working today, still holding, whether anyone watching it unfold at the time even realized what they were actually building. This doesn't require dynastic wealth to matter to you personally. It applies just as directly to a small family business with one succession plan and one backup plan, to a modest inheritance split between 2 or 3 siblings, to a single homeowner deciding how a property should pass down without turning into years of court proceedings between people who used to love each other. The scale changes. The underlying question never does. What happens to what you built the day you're no longer the one making the calls? Most people spend their entire working lives answering the first half of that question, how to build something, and almost none of their remaining time answering the second half, what happens to it afterward. The families still standing after 100 years, 200 years, are not the families who built the most. Several of the families that lost everything in tonight's video built more, at their peak, than the families who survived. The families still standing are simply the ones who eventually stopped treating the second question as something to worry about later, and treated it instead as part of the actual work, right alongside the building itself. There's a certain kind of quiet confidence in that decision, once you actually see it clearly. It's not the loud confidence of a family showing off a new mansion, or a new yacht, or a new title inside high society. It's the far quieter confidence of a family willing to admit honestly that no single person inside it, however capable, however well-intentioned, should ever be trusted alone with everything, forever, without any structure checking that trust. That's not cynicism about your own family. It's simply respect for how consistently, across 6 very different stories tonight, across 2 very different centuries and 2 very different continents, the pattern kept repeating itself, almost without exception. 6 families, 3 walls that held, 3 that never got built in time. And underneath every single one of tonight's stories, the same quiet question keeps resurfacing. Not how much you have right now, but what happens to it the moment you're no longer the one deciding. Think back, for a moment, over everything you just watched. A banking dynasty that gave up centralized control on purpose, splitting itself into independent branches so that no single failure could ever sink the whole family at once, while a shipping and railroad fortune, once the largest on the planet, dissolved into 787 meaningless shares within a single century. A Swedish family so deliberately invisible that it controls more of its own country's economy than almost anyone realizes, while one of America's most photographed families lost its protection from the inside, through a son entrusted with far too much unsupervised authority over his own incapacitated mother. A holding company engineered so that voting control survives even an active, public lawsuit between a mother and her own children, while an heiress with nearly $1 billion in today's money had absolutely nothing standing between her and every single decision she ever made, until $3,000 was all that remained. That question doesn't have a single universal answer, and no video, including this one, is going to hand you one that fits every family, every fortune, every situation you might personally be facing. But the families who actually got it right all seem to understand one uncomfortable thing early, long before it was tested: that protecting money from the outside world, from markets, from competitors, from bad economies, is honestly the easy part. Protecting it from the very people who are supposed to inherit it one day, including their own future selves, 20 or 50 years down the line, is the part almost nobody plans for in advance, until it's already far too late to fix anything at all. The spite are really what separates a family that merely got rich once from a family that built an actual legacy. Getting rich is an event. It can happen in a single generation, a single deal, a single stroke of timing or talent. A legacy is never an event. It's a structure, quietly doing its job decades after the person who built it is gone, still standing guard over decisions that person never lived to see made. Worth saying plainly, before we close, none of this is a suggestion that you need a fortune the size of any family tonight for the underlying principle to matter to you. The size changes. The mechanism doesn't. A modest family business with a clear succession plan is running the same logic as Exor. A simple, properly written trust for 2 children is running the same logic as the Wallenberg foundations, just at a scale that will never make headlines and was never supposed to. None of the 6 families you met tonight knew in advance exactly how their story would end. The Commodore Vanderbilt almost certainly believed in 1877 that a fortune that size simply couldn't disappear. Frank Woolworth almost certainly believed the same thing about the empire he was building for his granddaughter. Believing a fortune is safe has never once been the same thing as actually making it safe, and every family in tonight's video that skipped that distinction paid for the mistake in exactly the same currency: irrelevance, within 100 years, regardless of how large the original number once was. If tonight's video is the kind of thing you want to understand more deeply, not how to get rich quickly, because that was never the promise here and never will be, but how real, lasting wealth is actually engineered to survive its own family, subscribe, because we go deeper into exactly these families and exactly these mechanisms every single week on this channel. Next time, we're going somewhere most people never think to look at all: the quiet, unglamorous sports the ultra-rich actually choose to play behind closed doors, away from cameras and headlines, and why the sport itself was never really, ever, the actual point of playing it. Garlov, God bless you.